It is Friday, June 16th, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. And we're glad you did. My name is Wallace Smith. I'm sitting across the table from my podcast partner and co host, Mr. John Robinson. Mr. Robinson, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Air conditioner's been on all day. Got a little cold. I actually put on my jacket.
Did you? Different. We don't want to make the whole podcast about our air conditioning, but I actually had reached out to folks yesterday because mine was getting close to 80 and stuff. And anyway, definitely been comfortable today. We're so thankful for our support here at headquarters. But our air conditioner woes are not what this podcast is about. This podcast is about topics that matter to you, teens, young adults. In fact, today we have a particular topic. Mr. Robinson, what is our topic for the podcast today?
Our topic today is one that may not be obvious on its face. We'll talk about that when we get into it. But the idea is, how can you, as youth, be more parentable?
How can you be more parentable?
Yeah, that's a little mystery.
A little mystery. Let's jump on it. Greetings again and welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast. The topic today, I made up that word, I have to admit. Or as one particular famous superhero once said, all words are made up. But we just made up this one. I believe the title will be, we'll see, Mr. Robinson doesn't always like the titles I use, but will be, I think, Be Parentable. Be Parentable. Any quick evaluation of that title, Mr. Robinson?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's a real word or not, but I mean, the parallel would be something like being coachable,
Yeah, being coachable, being teachable, etc. But in particular, we want to talk to you, teens and young adults, about being parentable. That is, what can you do to be better so that you're better able to be parented by your parents. In fact, just this last Sabbath, I gave a sermon on fundamentals of parenting, but you parent children. And so we want to turn that around a bit and talk to you listening about how you can do your part. What can you do to be a more parentable child? And that might seem, if you're a young adult listening and you're in your young 20s, you might think, oh, I'm beyond all of that, right? It's not like I'm really parented anymore. Well, to a certain extent, certainly, you might already be married, have some young kids. At the same time, if you do have young kids, these are principles you're going to want to help them understand as they grow up. But even then, the principles matter in a larger way. Like, we hope to be more parentable by God, right? God is in heaven trying to parent us and trying to lead us and teach us. But in particular, this will have special application to the teens who are listening because you're old enough to think about what you're doing and you're responsible enough to act on what you know you should do. And so we want to give you some principles to help you be more easily parented. And so you can benefit from what God has placed in your life, that being your parents.
Yeah. Well, it would be really easy and understandable, frankly, especially if you're still under your parents, to think, well, I have no power. My parents have all the power. They make all the rules and the decisions and everything like that. And it's their job to parent me. But there are things that are within your power and your capability that could actually make your parents' life a little easier. And then maybe by extension, then making your life a little bit easier and make your relationship with your parents just a little bit smoother.
Yeah, absolutely. We all start in this life, I mentioned this, I think, in the sermon, we start in this life completely incapable of doing anything. We can't even clean ourselves, let alone feed ourselves. The best we can do is open our mouth and have someone stick food in it when you're born. But then you've got to make it from that to being a complete and functional and responsible adult Christian man or woman. And in between all of that, what has God done? Well, God has chosen to take you through that path, generally through the vehicle of the family structure that he has created, but that involves specifically the parents that he has appointed over you. And I hope we can think about it that way. In our congregations, we have pastors who've been appointed. We have elders who've been set apart. We have deacons set apart for various acts of service. Well, in your life, your parents have been set apart by God to help you go from point A to point B. And if anyone is in a position like that in your life, part of what you should think is, how can I make it easier for them? How they're literally committing themselves to my success, which will get us eventually here into the first point. But then what we want you to think is, well, then how can I make this easier? It's kind of like if you're in school, if your teacher is trying to teach you something you truly need to know. I know we all take classes and that we don't think we need to know, but maybe it's something you truly do need to know. Well, you want to make it easier for that person or make it harder? You want to make it easier. And so we're just going to jump right into it. The theme here is how to be more parentable. What can you do to be more parentable? And the very first point I want to give Mr. Robinson credit is something he wrote really triggered this thought, and I had not really thought about it this way. But the first point we want to make is what you can do. Here's what you can do. One thing. Assume the best of your parents' intentions. Go into your relationship with your parents assuming the best of their intentions. Mr. Robinson, that was something you thought of. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a legal term that has been the hallmark of the judiciary system in the United States for a long time. I don't know if we still follow this or not with how crazy life things are going on these days, but it was the idea of a reasonable man. I think that's the term. Is a reasonable man, like an average man would in any given situation assume certain things, and that just commonly among the average man, this is we'd all agree that water is wet, and then if you jump in, you're going to sink to the bottom. So along those lines, your parents, look, we know there's some imperfect parents out there. Maybe there's even some of you. We've seen some of the topic suggestions and emails that come in. We've had some that talk about, hey, I've come in from the world and had some pretty poor parenting. Do you have any advice? What we're aiming at here is just the average parent, the normal parent. It's going to be along a spectrum or along a scale as to how good they are, how attentive they are, everything, just like any other relationship you would have. But the even parents that maybe could do a little bit better, they still care about you. They're making decisions that, in theory, are going to help you be safer and better and grow up. They want you to succeed, I guess is what I'm saying. I've been in that situation when I was a kid growing up, that you wonder if your parents actually have your best interest at heart or not.
Like they're making decisions not in your best interest, like they're not even considering your needs in the decisions. Yeah.
Right. Well, then you grow up and you become you get married, you have your own kids, and you realize so many of the things your parents did make a lot of sense, and you could question, quibble over various details, of course. But what I do know for a fact that is that both my parents wanted to keep me safe and wanted to equip me for being an adult and being out in the world and for having my own family. And I just think one thing that you could do if you're a teen or younger out there and you're listening and your parents love you. They want you to be safe. They want you to succeed, and they're trying their best to protect you. However imperfectly we've all gone about it.
It is so important to have that in mind. I think I've used this fellow's example before here on the podcast. He's an old teacher that I knew back when I was teaching high school. And his name actually was Mr. Prater. I want to go and give his name. I want to honor him for this because nobody wanted his class. If you were assigned Mr. Prater's class, it just seemed like people were like, oh, no, I've got Mr. Prater's class, because he was strict. When I say strict, he would govern the direction in which people sat very minutely. Their heading had to be a certain number, like a certain fraction of whatever out of an inch in the corner, from the right.
Wow.
And from everybody had rulers. And
math teacher.
Math teacher. Yeah, math teacher.
That makes perfect
but
sense.
it was just, and he, even though the school moved to kind of a dressy casual, stuff, always a suit, full suit all the time, and you'd hear students just complain about him and complain. And I remember even thinking that, well, why is he doing all this? Is he doing it just because he wants to? It makes his life rougher, right? He's having to work harder than a lot of the rest of us on some of these. But what really impressed me was, these students would graduate, they'd go off and go someplace else. But when they would come back and visit at the school, who would they want to come visit? Mr. Prater. They would want to come and they talk to him, and he would love it. Of course, he would. As hard as he kind of struggled with them when they were there, he loved their visits, and they would chat and they would laugh. And part of it might have just been the joy of being a little bit more like a peer. But I also detected that it's because I think you get older, you get more experience, and realize, he was not doing all this just to create more hassle for
Yeah.
himself. He literally was trying to invest in in attitudes and mindsets and approaches to life that he thought I needed when I get out of the classroom.
I saw that, but in sports more. I'm more of a sports guy than you, so I pay more attention to it. And some of these really, especially when I was younger, and I would see these pro coaches or college coaches, college basketball coaches, and they were just seemed to me as these brutal authoritarians. But then later, as I paid more attention, I was intrigued by how many of their former students or players would come back and see them or call them and ask them for advice, like later in their career.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, don't get me wrong, I know there's some jerks out there in real life and in the coaching community, but like the tough ones, most of the players later came to appreciate that they were trying to mold them into the best player they could be. And I do
That's
think that
great.
that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, it is. Having taught high school, for years, I saw kids come through, and honestly, the ones that generally had the most freedom, that just kind of did whatever they want. In a lot of those cases, you could tell their parents didn't care. They thought they were just living, the old phrase, living the life of Riley. They just thought they could do, oh man, it's great, I do whatever I want. Meanwhile, they're picking up all sorts of baggage from the world, all sorts of damage. But they didn't complain about their parents, but their parents just, in a sense, didn't care.
Okay, so perfect setup here for something I was thinking about, which is I've read a book called Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters. I don't know if I've mentioned it on the podcast before.
I can't remember. I know I've heard you mention it before.
It's written by a woman, Dr. Meg Meeker, and one of the key premises of her book is she's writing to fathers, and she's trying to get fathers to understand how important, and she's focused on girls in this case, how important fathers are to girls, and don't fall into the trap of thinking mom raises the kids and your job is just to bring home a paycheck. The girls, they learn so much about how to be treated, and I've already digressed into a different podcast. But one of the things she said that was really quite interesting to me, which was a good sign, was when the daughters would seemingly kind of grouse or complain about how tough their dads are. But really, she said they were kind of bragging about it because whether the girls recognized it fully at that time or not, it meant dad cared and dad was trying to protect them. Even if thought dad was going overboard, he was too strict and had too many rules, the girls in general seemed to appreciate and understand that dad was just looking out after them.
Interesting.
It's a contrast to what you were saying about these kids that seem to get their way.
Yes.
Lack of parenting and it's not always because they don't care. It's just sometimes it's easy to get distracted and get into your own things, and you forget you got to raise your kids.
Well, thank you for that perspective, because I can reflect on my own parenting, and there were times when I should have, let's say, facets or times when I should have been more parenting. And you're right, it wasn't that I didn't care, but it is that I let myself get caught up in other things. I've just some other interest or some other demands. But the point about this point is to make sure, and actually many of these, frankly, are really about your mindset. That's the one thing that you can address is your mindset. And this world is going to tempt you. It's going to tempt you to think of your parents as being on the other team. There's your team, and then there's the other team, and it's going to tempt you to put your parents as if they're like opposition players on the other team. And do not give in to that. It's a lie. And as we said, I think in we had a podcast recently about lying. It will distort your view of reality. It'll distort your view of your parents, because there's going to be disagreements where you see things differently. But you can approach those disagreements as if they are people on the other team, or if your parents are on your team. And the fact is, most parents really do love you. They really do want you safe. They want you healthy, and they want you to succeed. And it's vital to start off with that mindset. But that doesn't mean it is sufficient. It's a good start, assuming the best of your parents' intentions. But I know I have a lot of friends and others where I definitely assume the best of their intentions, but that's not enough to actually establish a good mindset for being parented, right? Because, for instance, our second point, more than just assuming the best of our parents' intentions, you need to decide that you want to obey. that's part of your job as a child, is deciding that you want to obey. And we have some scriptures on that. Just it might be good to get those out of the way, Mr. Robinson. I don't know what you think. What could you read the
Sure.
scriptures? Some scriptures we have.
Let's get these scriptures out of the way.
Yeah, that's what we want to do, is make sure the Bible is out of the way. Yeah.
Okay, right. No, there's some good ones here. Ephesians 6:1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Also, Colossians 3:20. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. But there's an attitude, and I think this actually, well, hopefully we'll elaborate on it, is a pretty critical component. Judges 5:2. Actually, let's start in verse 1 because it kind of leads in a little bit better. Judges 5 and verse 1. Then Deborah and Barak, it's Barak, isn't it? Barak?
I think it's Barak.
All right.
We'll go with that.
The son of Abinoam sang on that day, saying, when leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord. What does that mindset, what does that say to you, Mr. Smith?
Well, you read the commands, and we were talking earlier. If we didn't at least discuss the command to obey your parents, we feel like the whole podcast would be a sham. God clearly commands children to obey. You read Ephesians 6, Colossians 3, but boy, go back to Judges in this circumstance, and here's what it says to me. It could have just said, perhaps, because they just had a big victory, and that was great, and it could have said in Judges 5:2, they could have sang, when leaders lead in Israel, bless the Lord, or bless the. They could have just done just that first part, but it's that second part that is just the kind of cha-ching there, right? So it's when leaders lead in Israel, and then it says further, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless the Eternal. There's an attitude there, right? There's an attitude. I mean, Mr. Robinson, what do you see the attitude being communicated there? The difference when it comes to being a child or being a son or being a daughter. There's clearly a difference between doing something begrudgingly or doing something because you're seeking to be willing to do it.
Well, you and I have had plenty of experience dealing with peers, dealing with our spouse, dealing with children, dealing in the workplace. And I don't even mean here at headquarters. You and I both have work experience previous to headquarters.
Right.
And there's a big difference between somebody who's grudgingly going along with what they think they have to do because they have no choice, but their attitude is anything but cooperative.
Right.
And so there's a huge difference between, listen, I'm not so sure about this, but I have some faith in you that this is going to work, and I'm going to put myself into the right attitude and do my best to go along and do it cooperatively. Saying something like, well, I don't know about this decision. That sure doesn't seem like a good decision to me, but you know what? God said I have to obey you, so I'm going to do what God says. Like that's not being cooperative and having a good attitude. That's not being submissive in any way. Like, people, we talk about the idea of submissive from time to time on the podcast. Like, submitting is not going along with a grudging attitude.
Right.
Submitting is having some faith that God's going to work it out. I think that's one of the things we'll pivot to here in a minute. But I would say the same thing that applies in marriages applies to a kid growing up in your parents' house, that have some faith in God that if your parents aren't, perhaps they haven't made a great call or they're doing something that's a little too strict, go with it with a good attitude and God will bless it. He does.
100%. The key word in that point was decide that you want to obey. Exactly the way you just described. All of us can do something begrudgingly, and yet how is God going to work in our hearts and in our character? And how much easier going to be for us to obey the next time if we feel like mentally we've just allowed ourselves to be dragged through it?
Well, I like how in Daniel, the first chapter of Daniel, when Daniel and his friends are suddenly in the situation where they have to make they're captives.
Mm-hmm.
They're there at the say throne, but in the kingdom under King Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, arguably probably the most powerful man on the earth at that time. And they're being offered unclean food. And what are they going to do about it? And they're younger. They were teens, late teens, maybe mid-teens. We don't know for sure. And I love the phrasing of it. Once Daniel realized they couldn't do this, it says he purposed in his heart. And if you look into that phrasing, it means he set his heart that no matter what the consequences were going to be, he was not going to do that. And I think that's kind of the sense of it. In any situation where you have to submit to somebody, you have to set your mind, your attitude towards, look, I don't know how this is going to turn out. Doesn't seem like maybe this is the best way to go, but I'm going to do it anyway because this is what God expects of me. And no matter, I've talked about it on the podcast before. There are numerous times I made a decision in our family that actually technically wasn't the correct decision, but it worked out anyway, and I could take no credit for it. But God blessed that I was doing the best, making the best call I could. My wife was blessed because she was going along with it no matter how she felt about it, and the kids too in different circumstances. And I think that's the key to it. You be prepared to obey, and we use that obey in as kind of charge, but like submit, that's also a charged word. But have faith that your parents actually have a clue about what they're doing and that they want you to succeed, and therefore, if you follow what God says, the best outcome will occur.
That's such a great example. Talking about Daniel, it makes me think that part of what's bound up in this idea of deciding that you want to obey is, in so many instances, if you've been given a charge, you've been asked to do something by your parents, or you've been told to do something by your parents, or you've been told not to do something by your parents, life will always, it'll happen for the rest of your life in all sorts of circumstances. It will throw you excuses not to do it. It could be the timing is bad. It could be that, I bet they didn't know about, blank over here or this or that. And I'm not talking about reasoning what your parents would actually want. I'm talking about excuses why you just will come up, excuses that your mind and your Jeremiah 17:9 heart will come up with for why. Yeah, I know, Mom, you said this, but because of this and this, well, I didn't do it. The world will, like Daniel, again, thinking this is what made me think of it is Mr. Robinson's example. Man, if Daniel had any excuse, it'd be like, well, man, we're not even in control of our whole lives anymore. And if we don't do what these guys say, they might kill us. I can't worship
Even
God
probable.
if I'm dead. Yeah, exactly. I can't worship God if I'm dead. So surely he's gonna forgive me for this. Surely he's not gonna worry about this. But instead, they wanted to obey God. They were looking for ways to still obey God when all the circumstances would have made it so easy to decide otherwise. And again, that's a mindset. That's setting your heart in a particular direction. And I need to give Mr. Robinson credit. We don't have Daniel in our notes, but look at that. The Bible's inside that guy, and it just popped out.
Don't ask me to cite script, chapter and verse. Sure.
Okay, the next one's a little weird, and since I came up with this one, and we had such fun talking about the word entreated earlier, I want to go ahead and introduce this one because I want to give it some context. Because you might think, and I can understand why we would, that it's similar to the last point. It's similar, but in my mind, it's different. The next point is, if you want to have this right mindset where you are more parentable, then seek to be easily entreated. And the words there, easily entreated, that's actually taken from James chapter 3. And James chapter 3 and the King James Version actually talks about the wisdom from above. The wisdom from this, I'm going to read from the King James Version first. The wisdom from above, that is from above, is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated. Now, my copy here actually doesn't spell entreated the way we do now, but easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. The New King James, and I'll talk about why I kind of like the old King James words better there. The New King James says essentially the same thing, but it changes those words in James 3 and verse 17 to willing to yield. So willing to yield. So that's not wrong. That's actually a great phrase. Certainly, if we're going to be parentable, we have to be willing to yield to our parents. However, I like the old King James word being easy to entreat, because here I'm not thinking of like a command our parents have given. Because there's times when you have an option. You've got things that you want to do, etc., but your parent comes to you with a need. Your parent comes to you with a thought, a desire. And it's very easy to have a mindset where you're really focused on your things, what's most convenient for you, what you want to do over what they're asking about. And to put it off, maybe you don't want to interrupt the game that you're playing, right? Maybe you don't want to put down the book that you're reading. But sometimes you have a grandmother or a grandfather or a parent who comes to you and has a desire they'd like. And maybe they've given you the option, and say, well, hey, could you help me do this? I really need some help. And they haven't commanded you to do it. And you have the option of declining. But are you easy to be entreated? It doesn't mean always having to put down that book. I mean, maybe it's something that's really important for that moment, but I'd like to encourage a mindset, and I struggle with this. I'm not saying that I've gotten this really perfect, but where you actually are open to yielding to someone's request, your parents in this particular case, even if it's inconvenient for you, because you want to be a responsive person. I think of Mr. Ames in this regard. He will talk sometimes in his sermons about his 6-second rule.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that if his wife makes a request, then he wants to get it to her in less than 6 seconds. He wants to have done that, so he would govern his life by that. If she makes a request, he wants to satisfy it in 6 seconds. Now, in that case, that's not a command. If you don't have Mrs. Ames commanding Mr. Ames to do these things, but it's a willing desire of his to satisfy her request. Now, I'm sure there's times when, he, like anybody would be, might be in the middle of something that can't be interrupted, right? Maybe you're working on the car and your hands are covered in grease and filth, and your wife doesn't realize where you've been working, and so she requests something like, could you please hand me my delicate tissues I use when I'm doing a flower arrangement or something? And you'd be like the worst human in the world to do that. But then there's at least a kind response. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry, dear. I can't. I'm really like this. It would probably, if you really need it now, it'd probably be easier for you to get them yourself right now. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. But that's not being rude or pushing back. Someone who's easily entreated is someone who, when they're brought a circumstance or a desire or a concern, they're truly open to hearing it and willing to set aside their own desires of the moment to yield to the other person, to allow their desires to take precedence, that is, the other person's desires to take precedence over their own. And that's, I know when I wrote that point, Mr. Robinson, it was probably kind of confusing, but that's what I had in mind. Is it sensible at all? Am I making any sense?
If in hearing you go through it and try to explain it, it sounds to me a little bit like you could characterize it as having a willing, serving kind of attitude.
Okay,
is that an oversimplification?
I would say that. I would say that's something I'm reaching for.
Well, we went down to Texas recently for my mom. She turned 80. It seemed like it was a good time for a visit.
Go see
my
her,
brother and my sister came up. And I have not always done this, which is why I'm saying that I've had to make myself do this. My mom has certain things that are important to her at her age and taking care of her property that she needs help with. And I have not always prioritized that in the past. And I've got my own things to do. I'm a grown man, all this kind of stuff. And I have forced myself to alter my approach and my attitude and actually set first the things that I know that are important to her. And there's a handful of things. I'm not going to go into it because they're personal. But and my trip goes better when I prioritize. There's things I do have to do and get done. Sometimes the LCN has to be laid out. But otherwise, I try to follow. There's a schedule I know she likes. There's things that she wants help with and just different things. And so I would, for me at least, this principle never has completely gone away as long as I've had a mother. The attitude that I needed to be open. I needed to be entreatable. Open to her when she needs some help with something, and she's not always going to ask in a way that's obvious, where it's like, oh, this is super important. I have to be, it's even kind of active listening. I have to pay attention because she can be subtle with the things she wants.
Interesting.
She mentioned at least 5 different times that her solar lights had gone out, but she didn't need them anymore, and who wants them? And I was telling my brother, I was like, I'm going to get some new lights from Mom. She's only mentioned 5 times how they broke, but she doesn't need new ones.
No, that you've nailed it. That's a great way to put it. And for those of us, for those listening who are not teens but do find yourself as young adults, I hope that this does apply to you the rest of your life. You know, the command, the fundamental command in the 10 Commandments is to honor your parents. Well, you know, when you become your own household, like we had a son get married recently, he's his own household. You look at Genesis, it's kind of plain. He's not under us in the same way anymore. You know, there's not a requirement to obey in that sense. I wouldn't command, right? But there's still this sense of being easily entreated by, you know, your parents. And I have to say that I'm very blessed in that regard. I feel, when I really think back, I mean, sure, you can always think your kids like, well, why didn't they hop to and do it right now? You know, why? I don't understand what took so long. And yet, if I look on the whole, I look overall, and it's amazing how far they've been willing to go to be deferential to me. And certainly when I make a request, but even sometimes when you don't make a request, when it's just something they're aware of that you would want, and doing those things. It's being easily entreatable is a matter of being in those moments when maybe it's not a command, like say your dad telling you to mow the lawn. But when your dad comes in and says, hey, if you have a few moments today, could you come out and help me do this? And being open to that and not looking for reasons not to do it because you had other plans, though sometimes you have to. Maybe you've got an exam and you realize I've got to study or I'm going to fail this class. You know, it's like, man, Dad, I'm really sorry. We're not talking about having to always do those things. You've got to be open and honest about the expectations on you that maybe your parents don't know about, but are you open to yielding to that? It's like, man, that's the last thing I wanted to do today is work in the garden. But at the same time, right, my dad needs me, you know, I'm going to go out there and do it.
I've seen other people set a very, very good example about that, which I cannot take any credit for. But I've always really admired when people do that.
Oh, good. It does. And it really is, frankly, what God is looking for. Honoring your parents, if we just think of that as obeying them, and that's it, they command me to do something and therefore I do it. It's kind of like congratulations for meeting the minimal standard, you know, but when you're really open to these voluntary things, that's different. And that definitely does get God's attention in a special way. So, let's move on to the next point,
okay.
Mr. Robinson. And I have to credit, even though I think I've heard it time to time in the church, it was actually comments by Jonathan McNair at the teen camp way back that kind of really awakened my brain to this principle. So, you teens out there and those who are yielding to your parents and want to be more parentable, I would ask you to embrace the fact that you are practicing for a larger world ahead, not just the kingdom in that regard. It's easy for us to say, you know, you're practicing for the kingdom. You're preparing yourself for your eternity. I don't just mean that. I mean your regular workaday life. I mean your life as an adult. Embrace the fact that in seeking to relate to your parents properly and to be parentable by them, you're actually preparing for the larger world in which you're headed. And the verses, the passage that was brought to my attention in that regard is 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verses 1 and 2. Mr. Robinson, you've got it up there in the notes, don't you? You're so awesome.
Well,
and then feel free and read it. You did the hard work, put it up there. Feel free and read it.
Okay. 1 Timothy 5:1 and 2. Okay. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. So here we have Paul saying, hey, how do you treat an elder in the church? You treat him like you would your father. How do you treat younger men? Treat them as you would your brothers. How do you treat older women? Treat them like you would your mother. And how do you treat the younger women around you? You treat them as sisters. What Mr. McNair mentioned at that time that just grabbed my attention was that essentially God uses the family to teach us how to interact with all the other levels of society, that your family is like a micro society. And what you're learning and how you deal with your parents and deal with your siblings in the end, you'll find that's how you end up dealing with the rest of the
Yeah.
world in a lot of ways.
Well, I hadn't heard that before, but that actually makes a lot of sense. One of your introductory notes, and I don't think we actually talked about this much, was when you get a little bit older and you kind of step back and start thinking about, well, why does God do the way things the way He's very specific and very structured in the way He does things. So, for example, why are we trained up in a family? And that's kind of part of what you're saying here. Really, growing up in a family, especially if you have some brothers and sisters, although it's not absolutely necessary, but you have a mother, a father, so you have an elder male, elder female, then brothers and sisters, and then I've come to appreciate aunts and uncles and grandparents and be included in that. You are well equipped to go out into the world and know how you should react to. And one of the things that was really emphasized when I grew up in the church, and this really benefited me, was we did not call, when we were kids, you didn't ever call an adult by their first name ever. They were always Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. And being down in the South, in particular, there was an emphasis on yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. My parents did not make us do that, but I actually appreciated it. And approaching people with deep respect until maybe they prove otherwise, but that's a different podcast. And it reminded me of something else. So kind of like, see how you feel about this analogy. So Spokesman's Club, and I don't know if any of our younger men in particular have had a chance to be in it. I think especially these days, Mr. Weston prefers to be 18, but
I think we try, and I think generally we try to make sure it's a baptized people, I think.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
right.
but now living education, though, that's part of their actual training,
right,
so
right.
they're in there as well, so that we do have that kind of mix, and it's a big part of their program. But yeah, living.
But the thing that was
Club.
fascinating to me about one of the benefits of club is it actually prepares you for every aspect of the church service. Kind of the Toastmaster. That's sort of like if you were going to be a song leader. Even the impromptu speech, I think about it, an opening and a closing prayer is a 1 minute long impromptu speech, where you kind of are given your topic during services. And so if you have the closing prayer, ideally in the, not the pattern, but the model for doing it, you mention lightly the two different topics. And anyway, club, every aspect of it prepares you for some aspect of church service, the church thing. And so I don't know if that supports you. That's what jumped into my head when you started talking about it. I love that idea a lot.
Oh, that's fast. I've never thought about that before. And Mr. McNair, I know he likes to talk about mechanisms, Mr. Jonathan McNair. When it comes to camp, there are certain mechanisms they put in place that help do this and that. And we were talking even, I can't remember, it was a week or so ago, but he's talking about certain mechanisms. Well, the family, in a sense, if you treat the family right, you respect your parents, you deal with your siblings in an honorable way, God has put in place a mechanism in the family that if you do those things, the attitudes you build, the understanding that you gain, it translates to the broader world. And you know how you deal with your boss at your job differently than a lot of other people do. You deal with your coworkers differently than a lot of other people do because you've let yourself learn through your experiences in the family. Personally, I know this is the case, but I think what the more speculative part is why. I know part of our problem of what we're seeing in society now is rampant fatherlessness. We have, it seems, more fatherless homes than ever. And what would be the natural result of that? Well, one obvious result, but one less obvious result. One would be children who don't learn how to interact with authority properly, like real powerful authority. And what do? You see individuals with no respect for other people at all, no respect for authority. But also, I believe this is less obvious, is individuals that don't learn how to relate to God, who is the ultimate authority in their life. In fact, what is God to us? Once we're baptized, he becomes a father. So our experience in the family is meant to teach us a larger picture, and we will become more parentable if we embrace that idea that we're not just here to survive our teen years, we're not just here to get by and be a good young person, we're actually here to practice what we're going to be doing in many larger ways, not just our whole life, but really throughout eternity, because we'll be interacting with our Father and our elder brother, Jesus Christ, for all time. So
Yep.
it is definitely, think of your family, think of your interactions as preparing you for a larger world, and I think that'll impact your parentability.
Yeah, I think back on growing up and how I didn't take advantage of all the opportunities I could have to really learn stuff or to be mentored by people. I didn't value it like I should. And I think one of the things I realized as an adult was, man, in your teens is is that perfect opportunity to push yourself and just know that you're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Like I don't mean like make a mistake like steal a car and not that kind of
I just
mistake.
know I'm going to make that mistake and end up stealing the car.
One of the things I realized is this is a little tongue in cheek what I'm saying here. Look, parents expect teens to make mistakes and not do everything correctly, so you might as well not. You might as well do it, and come out the other end with having gained a lot of valuable experience. Like I joke that if I write my memoirs, it'll be entitled "Everything I Know Is Because I Did It Wrong the First Time." I had to learn through experience heavily. And so to use my teens to like really, okay, is this, should I do it this way, and I would have tapped my dad more for his wisdom. And anyway, I don't know, sound like Pollyanna here, but I don't, your teens are a real opportunity. Frankly,
It is.
They shouldn't be viewed with dread, or they are awkward years, but you grow out of that, and you can come out on the other end as an adult really well equipped if you take advantage of growing up in a family with your parents accessible and protecting you. You don't realize how much they protect you. I know you youth out there that are listening to me are familiar with the term or the phrase "adulting is hard." Our kids have been going through that. Every so often I hear, especially my older daughter, say something like, "I didn't realize how much such and such cost." As she increasingly takes on more and more of her own
Right.
expense. And anyway, I've kind of rambled on here, but your teen years are actually a real opportunity, frankly, to set yourself up ideally for being an adult.
That's all good, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Rob McNair likes to make that point. He talks about the book he read some time ago. We've had that book too, Do Hard Things. And one of the points they make is that, the teenage years were kind of created as sort of a separate category that regrettably the world has sort of turned into an end in itself. In fact, I remember my wife and I would joke because I like to listen to old 80s music. If it's not terrible, I'll skip it, if it's something terrible. But that's what I grew up with. And there's so many songs where these guys will sing about how they wish they could go back and be a teenager again. And the one that sometimes I'll listen to is by Bruce Springsteen about glory days. But part of why I actually like that one is it has this era of it that, man, isn't it pathetic? Isn't it pathetic to just keep wishing you could go back and relive those days as opposed to actually, live the lives you have? So sometimes I'll give into that one and listen to it. But no, I thought you really nailed that sense of it. That's what Rob McNair likes to talk about, is that rather than think of the teenage years as some sort of end in itself, that either you just never want to leave it or want to get back to it, think of it as your preparatory years for adulthood. This is an opportunity. Take advantage of it. You don't have all the authority you might want, but you also don't have all the responsibility yet. It's growing and it's changing. And when it comes to interacting with your parents, it's not long after those years, you don't have them in that way anymore. You don't interact them with the same way anymore. They're still in your life perhaps, but it's just not the same. So absolutely take advantage of those years as an opportunity. And wow, Mr. Robinson, we might finish before an hour. We'll see about this. We're not doing too bad time-wise.
Well, let's not get too excited.
Let's not get too excited. We'll see. All right. The last point that we wanted to talk about today in terms of being more parentable, and I picked an adverb for this for a particular reason. The point is, the recommendation is, the advice is that you should be divinely open to correction.
Mm.
Divinely open to correction. Now, I know it seems obvious. If you want to be parentable, then be open to being corrected or disciplined or taught that you were wrong or made a mistake or need to do something in a certain way. But there's a reason I chose the word divinely. In Hebrews chapter 5, there's this fascinating statement about Jesus Christ that sometimes can trip people up, but it doesn't have to trip us up. And I feel that it helps to illustrate this particular
It's
point.
deep.
It is deep. There's much deepity with this statement.
Oh, we're making up all kinds of words. I thought maybe they should be divinely open to being incorrectable. That's so bad.
That is bad.
Treatable, incorrectable.
That would be terrible.
Makes it sound like the opposite.
It sounds like incorrectable,
Yeah.
like can't be corrected.
Can
so
I say
boo.
one thing
Oh no, say it.
before?
No,
So,
go.
because I was every kid out there, and so you say the word correction, and it immediately has a negative connotation. And I don't think, I would just encourage, and especially young listeners, don't view correction as automatically being something negative.
Right.
Correction is not even. It doesn't have to be a negative. It doesn't have to be like, oh, you're in trouble kind of
Right.
mindset. It's just, hey, you might want to know, for next time, this might be a better way. And
That's a
I've
great
been
way
corrected
to
a
put
lot
it.
of times where it was very nice, and I really appreciated it.
Yeah, and it's easy to think of it as just punishment.
Yep.
Being open to being
Right.
punished.
Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Yeah.
It's not a punishment to be corrected.
Right. Now,
Well, it can
punishment
be.
may be involved in
Right.
being corrected sometimes. However, this is going to sound really dumb. I wasn't planning. I didn't think of this example before we started, but I remember my mother telling me something shocking when I was young. And I mean, and it's when you hear it, it's going to sound so stupid. So let me say, when I was really young, okay, I was very young, but I remember her telling me that when you drive a car, you don't just hold the steering, like if you're going straight, you just don't hold the steering wheel straight. You'll find that you're always making little tiny adjustments, right? Well, especially with the little math brain that was growing in my tiny little Wally Smith's head at the time, that didn't make any sense, because if you're going straight, well, you should just set the steering wheel at essentially 0 degrees and you don't deviate. Why would you be constantly moving it?
That's logical.
Exactly. But that's not reality. You can write a program that does that, right? But that's not reality. You're always having to make little adjustments. In fact, if your drive from point A to point B was not filled with constant little corrections, you would never make it from point A to point B. We need little corrections. And in terms of being parentable, that's what our parents, that's part of their job. God tasks them to help us constantly adjust our life in one direction or another, in terms of one angle or another. And the statement about Jesus Christ in Hebrews chapter 5, I'm going to jump into a little bit of the middle. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and start the sentence. I should give Paul credit here. It's not that long a sentence. I'll start in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 6, but the real gusto happens here in verses 7 and 8. So in verse 6, it says, as he, speaking of the inspired word, is speaking of Jesus Christ, as he also says in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, who, again, speaking of Jesus Christ, in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him, who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear, verse 8, though he was a son, he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And you might think, okay, now wait, what's going on here? So verse 7 is talking about Christ pouring out his heart to God and asking to be saved here and there, and even being heard by God. And yet, and who is Jesus Christ? He is the Son of God. He is actually the Word, the eternal God being who was with God before the world was, who had been made a human being for the sake of this plan of salvation. And then it says in verse 8 that even though he was this son, he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And then verse 9, you could say, and having been perfected or completed, if you will, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Well, here's my point, that Jesus Christ did not use his status as the Son of God to kind of go around saying, well, I don't really need to learn anything. I kind of know everything. Well, no, he was living the life that we have to live in this flesh, limited as he was. He had, we see that he It says elsewhere, like in Philippians, that he divested himself of many of his divine prerogatives so that he truly could live life on earth like one of us. And in doing so, he walked a path that fully illustrated the burdens of obedience and what it means to decide the right in the opposition of the wrong throughout life. And even earlier in the Bible, when he's younger, it says that he grew in wisdom. And so he did grow. So even the Son of God allowed his Father to take him through very difficult times, knowing that in the end it was making a more complete Messiah of him, allowing it to serve its purpose in his life. And that's why I say not just being open to correction. When you're open to being redirected by God, and well, actually through your parents, you're open to being redirected by your parents, you're picturing what Jesus Christ himself has done. It is a beautiful, wonderful, divine thing to have a mind that is open to being corrected.
Yes. When I for a long time, struggle might not be the right word, but I was really quite intrigued by this idea that God, the Son of God, could learn anything in a sense. Like he the entire Bible in some ways is, hey, I told you guys not to do that. He knew how the decisions we would make would make us suffer, and he spelled it out. But, if he can learn to be just a little bit more of a complete work by going through and experiencing the human experience that he did in terms of living a flesh and blood life, walking around with his guys and sweating when it was hot and all those kinds of things. And he suffered greatly during his lifetime in certain respects, not the least of which, of course, was being crucified on the cross. And he gained a larger measure of perfection by going through it. That really says a lot. If you think about it, so if you, especially younger listeners, I'm starting to say younger listeners a lot. I may have to work on my, on that. But so he's God, he's perfect, he knows everything. But what would make him, and what's one thing that could make him an even more perfect high priest for us? Somebody that works on our behalf, and he's our intercessor. Well, imagine going through an entire life of suffering just as we've done, and actually obeying God all the way to the point of death. I mean, it was so important to Christ to not sin that he was not going to sin even if it cost him his life. And to be hanging there on the cross with the excruciating pain it was, and even greater suffering of having all the sins of the world laid on him, I mean, that was an experience that made him understand the human life. It wasn't like he sat up there on his throne in heaven and just knew how it would work. He actually lived through it the way we have.
It gives us confidence in our prayers that when we're praying, Jesus Christ, our intercessor, really does know what it's like to go through.
Yeah, because otherwise it really would be.
Doubt.
You could be praying and saying, well, you didn't actually live through it, so you
don't really know what I'm talking about, God, because you haven't been here, right?
Well, he does.
He does.
He went through
it.
So that's what a great point.
Now, one of the things we talked about concerning this point about being open to correction, this last point, and we talked about this a lot, actually, the other day we're talking about this podcast, is that we know there are times that you might know, okay, wait, I'm being corrected, and yet I know I'm right. I know I'm right. My parents are just wrong on this. I know that I'm right, and I know that they're wrong, and they're making a mistake. Well, what do you do in those circumstances? And those are challenging circumstances. We're not pretending that they're not. Frankly, I know my wife has to deal with that sometimes. There's times when I'm making a decision, and boy, in the deepest heart of her heart, she's like, man, this is a mistake. I just, what do I do about that? This is a life lesson. Again, going back to the other point, these are giant and broad points that actually have an impact on how you live your life on multiple levels. And the way I thought it'd be good for us to talk about it is, first, let's just, for the sake of argument, grant that you're right. I'm not saying you're right. That's one of the things you have to learn. But let's just say you are right. Maybe when your parents really think you should mow the lawn this way instead of that way because it's going to go faster, and they're just rock solid. You've reasoned with them. You've tried to explain, and they just don't see it. They want it done this way. I just picked lawn mowing as an example, but you could come up with more profound examples. Well, what if you just know you're right? How do you deal with that? Well, that's when the rubber meets the road and you have the attention of God in heaven. And I thought the passage in 1 Peter chapter 4 spoke to that. I see you've got it in the notes here, Miss Robinson. You're really pulling from that King James version here, aren't you? You really. We were just talking
did
about
I
that.
pull
There.
from the
Yeah,
King?
you're pulling
Oh,
from the
that
King
was an
James
accident.
version.
Sorry.
I thought you just liking yourself some King James.
You were talking about the King James, and so I flipped over to see what it said. And
Oh,
if you
okay.
copy entreatable INT and into the dictionary on the Mac, it changes it to EN.
Yeah, because en is how we would spell it. We would spell it in the modern days. Exactly right. So in 1 Peter chapter 4, I thought this verse kind of applied. And Mr. Robbins, we haven't discussed it yet. You can let me know what you think after you read it. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 15 and 16. It's some very practical advice that Peter is giving to Christians. I mean, adults and children, just all of us. But I think it especially applies in this case where you're being corrected by a parent and you just know that you're right. So in 1 Peter 4 and verse 15, we read here, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters." That is, don't suffer because you actually did do something wrong and deserve, to be suffering. Verse 16, "Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter." That is, when you're suffering for doing the right thing, when you're in the right and yet you're still suffering as if you've done something wrong, then that's not a time to feel shame or to defile yourself. Rather, that's an opportunity to glorify God in that suffering. That's when the rubber really meets the road. If God sees you getting punished for doing something dumb, well, he's not going to be impressed. He's
Yeah.
going to hope it works and you don't do a dumb thing
well,
anymore.
you did something dumb, suffered the consequences, and I'm really impressed with how you handled it.
That's right. But whenever, you just know, it's like, you're actually it's going to take you twice as long to mow the lawn, and you're going to have to buy more gas, and it's out of your allowance maybe for some reason because that's the way your parents have it set up, and yet you're doing this, and then it's not even just because you're having to pay for the gas and you're not being allowed to decide how the lawn ought to be mowed. But you're suffering under that. If you can do it respectfully with a yielding attitude, and I'm not saying not explaining your case. I'm not saying that. That's a whole nother lesson, is learning how to respectfully explain your disagreement with your parents, where you still maintain this loving, respectful attitude. Christ did that before his crucifixion. He went to his Father and he didn't want to die. He was hoping surely there's some other way in all of this that this could be done. But when he prayed before his Father, after saying that surely, you, if anyone, can come up with a way so I don't have to go through this suffering, and yet not my will, but your will be done.
Yep.
So when you're in those moments, that is really when the rubber meets the road, and God is involved and God is watching. But more than watching, he's willing to help you have that right attitude as you explain things to your parents. And even if they still disagree, how do you take and how to be open to correction, even when deep down you know you're right?
Yeah, and another factor in all this is at the because like all too many times you and I have both seen instances where people, and whether they're right or wrong about the decision of a leader, they feel like, oh, well, this isn't the right decision, therefore I do not have to submit to this leader, whether that's a parent or a minister or whatever.
Right.
I don't know about you, Mr. Smith, but my experience and also my studies in the Bible have found that, I want to say always, but maybe I just to leave myself a little wiggle room, I would say almost all the time, God always prioritizes submitting and and being in obedience to an authority figure, whether they're right or not.
Right.
Like over being right, maybe is another way of
Yes.
saying it.
Now, there's one thing to like, and Mr. Meredith had to address this with when the church dissolved and worldwide. Is Mr. Armstrong made mistakes and misunderstood things. From time to time, we've talked about him before. Divorce and remarriage. That was a massive misunderstanding. Yep. There's when Pentecost takes place. That was a big one. We're literally worshiping on the wrong day. The Bible doesn't indicate, but what he saw in the Worldwide Church of God was that, now we're not talking about a misunderstanding. We're talking about actually a casting aside any desire to actually, we're actually talking about getting rid of the law, not a misunderstanding about how to actually keep it. And so, and it potentially can come to that with parents. I mean, if you have a a rare parent that actually tells you to sin. You're like, you must sin. You've got to do that. That's super evil parent. But that's not the kind of thing where, I mean, if that's the case, talk to your minister. There's clearly a situation there, but that's not what we are talking about here. We're talking about those things where there's some correction going on, and it doesn't, you don't feel that it's the right direction. You feel there's a wiser way to do things, or in some case where there's a disagreement there, and we're talking about being yielding and open to that anyway. The example that comes to my mind often is King David. When King David was suffering some of the past effects of his previous choices, and he's being run out of town by his own son, and Shimei comes up. And I never know if I say Shimei's name wrong. How do you say that name, Mr. Robinson? Do you have
I think I say Shimei.
Shimei? We'll
But
go with that.
I mean, it ends with an E and an I, so I say pick whichever one.
We'll go with Shimei. So Shimei comes out, and he's this fella, and he's just cussing David out.
Throwing rocks at him.
Oh, throwing rocks at him. And the men with David want to kill the guy. Like, please, they say, please let us kill, because they're getting hit with rocks too. Please let us kill this guy, And the thing is, he was wrong, Shimei. He was insulting and casting these serious aspersions on and reviling God's anointed leader, David. David himself passed that test when it comes to Saul, right? And yet here is Shimei failing the test, and indeed he was punished for it later under Solomon. He was killed for it. So God did take note, but David realized, no, God has allowed this circumstance. I am going to learn from it. And he did not have him executed on the spot, and he allowed for that. And I've always thought that was such an impressive example of being yielding to correction.
I couldn't agree more. That is an easy one to underestimate how difficult that would have been.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the king. He could have easily dispatched this guy, and the guy was in error, clearly.
Absolutely.
But David, recognizing that God's hand was in everything that was happening here, recognized, well, maybe there's yet another lesson here I could learn by this man's cursings and rambling. Your point about, when Dr. Meredith, look, the Worldwide Church of God had fallen fully into apostasy and was no longer teaching the truth at all anymore. But even with that being said, I'm not trying to undermine that at all. I'm just saying you have to still be really careful, because it's way too easy to not have your bar be high enough on the threshold of not.
Oh yeah. Dr. Meredith clearly struggled with it and wanted to make sure he was not in rebellion. When the Bible declares rebellion to be equivalent to the sin of witchcraft, you take that. Yep. You take that very seriously.
Yeah. Well, one of the examples that I often think of is King Ahab of Israel, and no two ways about it. He was an evil man. The Bible makes it quite clear. And yet here was this servant, Obadiah, who was protecting the priests of God in caves. I think he went to 50 to a cave and fed them with water. But he did not rebel against Ahab. He was still serving him. Mm-hmm. Ahab had instructed him that the drought had gotten really bad. They couldn't find enough grass, and so they split up the land to try to find. Anyway, the point is, Ahab was an evil king. Ahab's wife was trying to kill the servants of God, yet at the same time, he still, to the best of his ability, was loyal to Ahab and served him.
Interesting.
And I just always think that's interesting.
And that kind of leads me to the capstone of this particular point about being divinely open to correction, because I prefaced the last part of the discussion with, but what if deep down, and you know that you're right. You just are 100% sure, and that your parents are wrong. Here's the thing, and I want to say marriage has taught me this better than many other things, is when you're willing to still yield to the other person, in this case your parents, and yield to that correction, it does keep you open to that possibility, as impossible as it seems in the moment, that maybe you're wrong. And sometimes that is not apparent until a month later or a year later, or maybe you're already an adult and you're married and you have your own kids, and suddenly you're able to look back on that time when you were 15 or 16 and realize, oh man, I was wrong. I was wrong that whole time, and I never realized it. One of my favorite quotes related to this is from Mark Twain. And I think I wish I'd verified this is the exact quote, because I understand he said something like this, but let me just say, feel free and verify it yourself. But I believe this was the quote from Mark Twain, where he said, I'll read it like Mark Twain voice, when I was a boy, but I have no idea how he sounded. When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. When I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years. And the point being, his dad didn't learn a whole bunch in 7 years. Mark Twain at 21 was able to just understand things a bit differently than he did at 14. And the fact is, there's some things you as a teen will only fully understand after time and experience. And so being open and divinely yielding to correction keeps your mind open in that way, so that maybe one day God actually will show that to you. In fact, if you take the alternate route and you rebel and you fight against that correction because you know you're right and you're digging in your heels, you actually begin building a wall of defense around that idea that when the moment of wisdom could have come later in your life, you're already so dug in on that, it's going to take you longer to learn something like that. So yeah, be divinely open to correction.
Excellent. How would you wrap this up?
How would I wrap this up? All right. In the end, what do we want? We want God to bless us. All of us want God to bless us. You want God to bless you. Mr. Robinson and I want God to bless us. And your parents also want God to bless you. We want God on our side. We want God helping us. We want God holding us up and guiding us and guarding us as we continue to grow. That's true for you as teens. It's true for you as young adults. It's true for me and Mr. Robinson as not so young adults as we continue to get older. In the very first part of our life, our parents, our mother and father, are the God-ordained vehicles through which He gives us many of our most important blessings. And with that in mind, if that's true, and it is, then the wisest thing we can do is to seek to be as parentable as we possibly can and be open to the tools that God has put in place in our lives to shape us and mold us.
Smith and Robinson.